The night the ice storm sealed Thornfield County inside a tomb of frozen glass, Janet Keller stood in her living room watching through the window as headlights appeared one by one in her driveway. Vehicles she recognized. Trucks belonging to people who had spent the last 8 months calling her paranoid, wasteful, and worse. And now they were here, parked outside her stone farmhouse in the middle of the worst weather disaster the county had seen in 40 years, because somewhere behind the massive fieldstone fireplace dominating her living room wall sat the only functioning emergency supply cache for 20 miles in any direction. A room they had mocked relentlessly until the power failed and the cold started winning. But that reckoning was still hours away. The trouble started 10 months earlier on a Tuesday morning when contractors arrived at Janet's property hauling pallets of concrete block, treated lumber, and industrial shelving that looked far too heavy for residential use. Janet was 53, a retired civil engineer who had moved back to her family's old farm after her mother passed, and she had spent those first quiet months alone studying county infrastructure reports, weather patterns, and power grid vulnerabilities with the kind of focus most people reserve for hobbies. What she found didn't comfort her. Thornfield County sat at the end of 3 separate utility corridors, each one outdated and poorly maintained. The roads flooded during heavy rain. The power lines sagged under ice every winter. Emergency services were stretched thin across too much rural territory. And while the county kept promising upgrades, nothing ever changed. So Janet stopped waiting for someone else to solve the problem and started building her own solution. The fireplace was the key. The original stone structure had been built by her grandfather in 1952, a massive floor-to-ceiling monument of fieldstone and mortar that dominated the north wall of the living room. Beautiful, solid, and completely impractical for modern heating. Most people would have torn it out. Janet saw opportunity. Behind that wall sat and used space, a narrow cavity running the full height of the house where the old chimney chase had been sealed off decades ago. Enough room, if framed correctly, for something no one would ever notice. She hired a structural contractor from 2 counties over, someone who wouldn't talk at the local diner, and had him cut a concealed door into the stonework, disguised so perfectly it looked like nothing more than a seam in the masonry. Then she built inward, reinforced shelving, climate-controlled ventilation, dedicated wiring independent from the house electrical system. And once the frame was complete, she began filling it. Canned vegetables, dried beans, rice, flour, powdered milk, salt, sugar, medical supplies, batteries, lanterns, water purification tablets, a backup propane heater with independent venting, blankets, tarps, hand tools, duct tape, fire starters. Everything organized, labeled, rotated, maintained. She worked quietly, ordering supplies in small batches from different vendors, spreading deliveries across months so no single purchase looked unusual. And for a while, no one noticed. Until the day Brenda Coles from the church auxiliary stopped by unannounced and caught Janet unloading a pallet of canned soup from a delivery truck. Planning for the apocalypse, Jan? Brenda had laughed, not quite joking. Janet smiled politely. Just stocking up. That's a lot of soup for one person. Sales. But Brenda's eyes lingered on the boxes, counting, calculating, and by that weekend the story had spread through Thornfield like water through cracked pavement. Janet Keller was hoarding food, building some kind of survivalist bunker, going paranoid in her old farmhouse. The rumors grew with each retelling, exaggerated and twisted until people started driving past her property just to see what the crazy prepper lady was doing now. At the feed store, men laughed about her wasting money on disaster fantasies. At the grocery, women whispered that Janet had always been a little too intense, a little too much. Even her cousin, Tom, who farmed the adjacent property, shook his head when she tried explaining her reasoning over coffee one afternoon. "You really think the power's going to fail that bad?" he asked. "I think it's possible. And you think you need a whole hidden room for it? I think being ready costs less than being caught unprepared." Tom stirred his coffee slowly. "You know people are talking, right? Let them. They think you've lost it, January." She met his eyes steadily. "They can think whatever they want. I'm not planning to need any of this. But if I do, I'll have it." Tom left shaking his head, and the distance between Janet and the rest of Thornfield grew wider. She stopped going to church socials, stopped explaining herself, just kept working, kept preparing, kept stocking the hidden room behind the stone fireplace, while the rest of the county carried on assuming that modern conveniences would always be there when needed. And then October arrived, colder than usual, wetter than expected, and the forecast models started showing something nobody wanted to believe. A massive freeze moving south out of Canada, colliding with moisture-heavy air across the plains. Freezing rain, ice accumulation, sustained cold. Janet watched the reports every evening, her jaw tightening as the predictions worsened. 3 days before it hit, she sealed the concealed door and stopped going into town entirely. And when the storm finally came, it came fast. The ice started Thursday evening, so light at first it looked almost beautiful. A fine glaze coating the trees, the fences, the power lines strung across the county like fragile thread. By midnight, the weight had begun to tell. Branches cracking in the darkness with sounds like gunshots. Transformers exploding in blue flashes across the valley. And then the power failed, section by section, until Thornfield County went black and silent under a sky that kept dropping frozen rain without mercy. Inside her farmhouse, Janet lit oil lamps and checked her systems methodically. The house itself stayed warm, insulated properly, and heated by a wood stove she kept burning steady. But she also activated the backup propane heater hidden behind the fireplace, keeping the concealed room at a stable temperature independent from the rest of the house. She checked her inventory one last time. Water, food, medicine, fuel, everything accounted for. Then she made coffee on the wood stove and waited. By Friday morning, the damage was catastrophic. Ice coated everything in a shell half an inch thick, turning the county into a frozen sculpture garden where nothing moved and nothing worked. Roads became impassable, slick glass surfaces that sent vehicles spinning into ditches. Power lines sagged and snapped under the weight. Trees collapsed onto houses. And the temperature kept dropping, falling into the teens, then lower, while the ice kept building. Tom's wife, Linda, called Janet's landline, one of the few things still working, around noon, her voice shaking. Our heat's out. Generator won't start. It's already below 50 inside. Come here, Janet said immediately. Tom said, I don't care what Tom said. Get in the truck and drive slow. You can make it. They arrived an hour later, Tom's face tight with shame. He didn't speak, Linda shivering so hard she could barely walk. Janet brought them inside, sat them near the wood stove, wrapped them in blankets, and handed them hot coffee without a word about the months of mockery. When Linda finally stopped shaking, she looked around the warm house in disbelief. How are you still okay here? Preparation, Janet said simply. Tom stared at the fireplace, at the steady heat radiating from the wood stove, at the oil lamps glowing softly on the tables. We laughed at you. I know. I told people you were wasting your money. Janet poured more coffee. You weren't the only one. By Saturday, the situation across the county had collapsed completely. No power. No heat. Roads still impassable. Emergency crews unable to reach most properties. Pipes freezing inside walls. Families burning furniture to stay warm. And then the knock came. Brenda Coles, the woman who started the rumors, standing on Janet's porch with her teenage son, both of them frost-pale and desperate. Please, Brenda whispered. Our house is freezing. I didn't know where else to go. Janet opened the door wider without hesitation. By Sunday, 6 people sheltered inside the farmhouse, sleeping in the living room near the wood stove, rationing the food Janet cooked on the stovetop. And still, no one had seen the supply room. Janet kept the concealed door sealed, pulling from the main pantry instead, stretching her visible supplies carefully. But she knew it wouldn't last. The storm wasn't breaking. More people would come. And eventually, she'd need to open the room no one believed existed. Monday brought 3 more families. Then 5 more people Tuesday. The farmhouse filled beyond capacity, frightened neighbors crowding into every available space, and Janet's main pantry began to empty. She watched the dwindling supplies with quiet calculation, knowing the moment was coming. The moment they'd realize what she'd really built. That night, after everyone slept, Tom found her standing alone in the kitchen. We're running out of food. I know. Jan, if this goes another week. She turned toward the fireplace. It won't. How can you possibly? Janet walked to the stone wall and pressed her hand against a specific section of mortar. Something clicked. A seam appeared where none had been visible before, and a section of the stone facade swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow doorway. Beyond it, shelves stretched into darkness, packed floor to ceiling with organized supplies. Tom's mouth fell open. "Oh my God." Janet stepped inside and flipped a battery-powered lantern. The hidden room illuminated around her, showing rows of canned goods, medical supplies, water containers, fuel, blankets, everything the county had mocked her for preparing. Tom stared in absolute silence. "This is what they laughed at," Janet said quietly. "This is what I built while everyone said I was paranoid." Tom's voice broke. "Jan, I'm so sorry. Help me carry supplies out," she said, handing him a crate. "We're going to need them." Word spread fast once the concealed door opened. By Wednesday morning, everyone sheltering in Janet's farmhouse knew the truth. The woman they had ridiculed had built something extraordinary behind her stone fireplace, a fully stocked emergency cache that could sustain them all far longer than anyone imagined possible. And the shame that settled over the house was thick and uncomfortable, made worse by Janet's complete lack of gloating. She simply organized, rationed supplies, assigned tasks, kept people fed and warm while the storm continued burying the county under ice. She showed Linda how to operate the backup propane heater, taught Brenda's son how to purify water using the filtration tablets, walked Tom through inventory rotation so nothing spoiled. The hidden room behind the fireplace became the center of their survival, and Janet moved through it with practiced efficiency that made it clear she planned every detail months in advance. Thursday afternoon, rescue crews finally reached Thornfield County on heavy equipment, cutting through ice-choked roads to check on isolated properties. When they arrived at Janet's farm, they found 18 people sheltered inside a warm house, well-fed and safe, supplied by a concealed emergency room nobody outside that house had believed existed. The county emergency coordinator, a tired man named Paul Hendricks, stood in Janet's living room staring at the open doorway in the stone fireplace with something close to awe. "How long have you had this?" 10 months. "And you built it yourself?" "I hired a contractor for the structural work. The rest I did alone." Paul shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, this setup probably saved lives." Janet glanced at the people crowded into her living room. Families who had mocked her for months, now sitting warm and safe because she'd ignored their judgment entirely. It did what it was supposed to do. By the time power returned Saturday evening, the story had spread beyond Thornfield. News crews arrived asking to see the hidden supply room. Janet refused interviews, but allowed emergency management officials to document her design. Within weeks, the county issued new guidelines recommending emergency supply storage for rural properties. 3 families on her road started building their own concealed pantries. The feed store began stocking long-term storage supplies. Tom came by one evening after everything settled, carrying a toolbox and a sheepish expression. "Thought maybe you could use help repairing that back fence." Janet smiled faintly. "I could." They worked in silence for a while before Tom finally spoke. "I owe you an apology. A real one." "You already apologized." "Not enough." He set down his hammer. "I spent months making you feel crazy for being prepared. And when everything went bad, you saved my family without hesitating." His voice caught. "That's something I won't forget." Janet looked at him steadily. "People fear what they don't understand. I didn't build that room to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I needed to know I could take care of myself if everything failed. And you did." "We all did," she corrected. Brenda's eyes were wet when she handed it over. "We were cruel to you," Brenda said quietly. "And you saved us anyway." Janet accepted the envelope but didn't open it. "I did what anyone should do." "No," Brenda said firmly. "You did what almost nobody would have done. You prepared when we mocked you, and you shared when we needed you. That's not common. That's extraordinary." After Brenda left, Janet sat alone in her living room, the sealed stone fireplace warm and solid before her. She thought about the 10 months she'd spent working in secret, building something no one believed she needed. Thought about the storm that proved her right in the worst possible way. Thought about the people who'd laughed, then needed her, then thanked her. And she realized the truth that mattered most. She hadn't built the hidden room to be right. She'd built it to be ready. And when the moment came, that readiness had been enough. Not just for her, but for everyone who'd needed shelter when the world turned cold and unforgiving. The concealed door remained closed. The supplies sat organized and waiting. And Janet Keller returned to her quiet, prepared life, knowing that if another storm ever came, she'd be ready for it. Just like before. Just like always.